We are reading The 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid, Khalidi. Today we are starting on page 160. On September 17th, as the massacres Loren Jenkins and John Randall described to us continued, Philip Habib's assistant, Ambassador Morris Draper, was instructed by Washington to press Shamir and Sharon for a commitment to leave West Beirut. Sharon characteristically escalated things. There are thousands of terrorists in Beirut, he told Draper. Is it your interest that they will stay there? Draper did not demur at this false assertion, but when the exasperated U.S. envoy said to the assembled Israeli officials, "We think you should have come in to West Beirut. You should have stayed out." Oh, excuse me. Let me say that again. "We didn't think you should have come in to West Beirut. You should have stayed out." Sharon bluntly told the ambassador, "You did not think, or you did think. When it comes to our security, we have never asked, we will never ask. When it comes to existence and security, it is our responsibility, and we will never give it to anybody to decide for us." After Draper mildly challenged Sharon on another claim involving terrorists, Israel's defense minister flatly said, "So we'll kill them. They will not be left there. You are not going to save them. You are not going to save these groups of international terrorism." Sharon could not have been more chillingly explicit. Unbeknown to Draper or the U.S. government, at that very moment the LF militias that Sharon's forces had sent into the refugee camps were carrying out the killing of which he spoke, but of unarmed old people, women, and children, not supposed terrorists. If Sharon's forces did not carry out the actual slaughter, they had nonetheless armed the LF to the tune of $118,500,000, trained them, sent them to do the job, and illuminated and facilitated their bloody tasks with flares. That Sharon's intention to use the LF in this way was premeditated stands out in scores of pages of the secret appendices to the Commission's report. Sharon, the Army Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Raphael Eaton, the Chief of Military Intelligence, Major General Yehoshua Sagwe, the head of the Mossad, Yitzhak Yofi, and Yofi's deputy and successor, Nahum Edmoni, all knew full well of the atrocities perpetrated by the LF earlier in the Lebanese war. They also knew of the lethal intentions of Bashir Gemayel and his followers toward the Palestinians. While those named vigorously denied such knowledge to the Kahan Commission, the evidence that it collected and kept secret is damning, and it informed the Commission's decisions. Nonetheless, the killings in Sabra and Shatila were not just a result of the LF militias' thirst for revenge, or even of these Israeli commanders' premeditation. As with the war itself, these deaths were also the direct responsibility of the U.S. government. In planning for the invasion of Lebanon, Israel's leaders had been wary of repeating the fiasco of 1956, when their country had attacked Egypt without U.S. approval and been forced to back down. Having learned from this bitter experience, Israel only went to war in 1967 after receiving the backing of its American ally. Now, in 1982, launching this war of choice, as many Israeli commentators called it, was entirely dependent on the green light given by Alexander Haig, a point confirmed by well-informed Israeli journalists soon after the war. The new and fuller details revealed in previously unavailable documents make the case clear. Sharon told Haig exactly what he was about to do in great detail, and Haig gave his endorsement, amounting to another U.S. declaration of war on the Palestinians. Even after a public outcry over the deaths of so many Lebanese and Palestinian civilians, after the televised images of the bombardment of Beirut, after the Sabra and Shatila massacres, American support continued undiminished. In terms of what Ari Fulman called the outer circles of responsibility, American culpability for Israel's invasion extends even further than Haig's green light. The United States supplied the lethal weapon systems that killed thousands of civilians and that were manifestly not used in keeping with the exclusively defensive purposes mandated by American law. Sharon explicitly forewarned U.S. officials that this would happen. According to Draper's later recollections, after he and Habib met with Sharon in December 1981, he reported to Washington that in Israel's planned attack, we were going to see American-made munitions being dropped from American-made aircraft over Lebanon, and civilians were going to be killed. Moreover, the Israeli High Command and intelligence services were not the only ones who were aware of the murderous propensities of the LF toward Palestinian civilians. Their American counterparts were just as knowledgeable about the LF's bloody track record. Because of this knowledge, because of American backing for Israel and tolerance of its actions, its supplies of arms and munitions for use against civilians, its coercion of the PLO to leave Beirut and refusal to deal directly with it, and its worthless assurances of protection, the 1982 invasion must be seen as joint Israeli-U.S. military endeavor. Their first war aimed specifically against the Palestinians. The United States thereby stepped into a position similar to that played by Britain in the 1930s, helping to repress the Palestinians by force in the service of Zionist ends. However, the British were the leading party in the 1930s, while in 1982 it was Israel that called the tune, deployed its might, and did the killing, while the United States played an indispensable but supporting role. After we learned of the massacres in Sabra and Shatila, we knew that it was not safe for us to remain in Beirut, especially with our two small children and with Mona about to have a third. Our journalist friends put us in touch with Ryan Crocker, the senior American political officer and the only U.S. diplomat still at the embassy in West Beirut. Crocker not only offered to arrange our evacuation as U.S. citizens, he would also escort us out of Israel-occupied Beirut in an armored vehicle belonging to the embassy. But he could only take us to the Israeli-Syrian lines between Bamdoun and Sofar in the Lebanese mountains because of reports of presence of Iranian Revolutionary Guards in Syria-controlled territory. When I told him that we had to get further than that, to nearby Shatura in the Bekaa Valley, whence we could take a taxi to Damascus, he assented. Crocker was as good as his word. On September 21st, the day Amin Gimal was elected president of Lebanon in place of his assassinated brother, we left Beirut with him and a driver, crossed the Israeli and LF lines, reached Shatura, and went on to Damascus by taxi. Once there, however, instead of taking us to our hotel, the driver deposited us at one of many offices of the Syrian intelligence services. There, Mona, now 7 months pregnant, my brother and I were treated to several hours of detention, punctuated by separate interrogations of each of us that featured such penetrating questions as, did you see any Israeli soldiers in Beirut? The Syrian security apparatus fortunately did not interrogate my 67-year-old mother or our two little daughters, and eventually we were released, after which we went to our hotel and then left Damascus as quickly as we could. We flew to Tunis, where we reunited with some of our Palestinian friends from Beirut who had been evacuated there. In Tunis, I first developed the ideas that eventually became my book about the decisions taken by the PLO during the 1982 war under siege, and began discussions with some of the PLO leaders whom I later interviewed for the book. We then went on to Cairo, where Mona and I both had family, and we realized how badly the war had affected the girls. They went into a wild panic when they heard the screeching rumble of trolley cars in an adjacent street, thinking they were Israeli tanks. As soon as the Israeli army withdrew from West Beirut and the airport opened, we went back to the city. Mona insisted on having our third child delivered by the same obstetrician who had delivered our two daughters, and whose father had delivered Mona herself over 30 years earlier. Our son Ismail was born in November 1982. Ishmael. And I returned to teaching at the AUB and continued to work at the IPS. After a tense few months marked by the suicide bombings of the U.S. Embassy in the spring of 1983, we left Beirut for what we expected would be just a year away. But the Lebanese war erupted in force once again, and we never returned to our Beirut home. The political impact of 1982 war was enormous. It brought about major regional changes that affect the Middle East to this day. Among its most significant lasting results were the rise of Hezbollah in Lebanon and the intensification and prolongation of the Lebanese Civil War, which became an even more complex regional conflict. The 1982 invasion was the occasion of many firsts. The first direct American military intervention in the Middle East since U.S. troops had briefly been sent into Lebanon in 1958, and Israel's first and only attempt at forcible regime change in the Arab world. These events, in turn, engendered an even fiercer antipathy toward Israel and the United States among many Lebanese, Palestinians, and other Arabs, further exacerbating the Arab-Israeli conflict. These were all consequences that flowed directly from the choices made by Israeli and U.S. policymakers in launching the 1982 war. The war also provoked intense reactions, including widespread revulsion against its results among important segments of Israeli society, leading to the rapid growth of the Peace Now movement, which had been founded in 1978. It also produced the first significant and sustained negative American and European perceptions of Israel since 1948. For many weeks, the international media widely disseminated disturbing images of intense civilian suffering in besieged and bombarded Beirut, the first and only Arab capital to be attacked and then occupied by Israel in this way. No amount of sophisticated propaganda by Israel and its supporters sufficed to erase these indelible images. And as a result, Israel's standing in the world was severely tarnished. The entirely positive image that Israel had assiduously cultivated in the West had been appreciably harmed, at least temporarily. The Palestinians garnered considerable international sympathy as a result of the siege. In another first, they at least partially shed the terrorist label Israeli propaganda had successfully affixed to them, and appeared to many as David facing Israel's Goliath, like military juggernaut. But in spite of this limited improvement in their international image, they failed to obtain sufficient support, whether from the Arab states, the USSR, or others, to counterbalance the grimly determined backing of the Reagan administration for Israel's key war aim of dislodging the PLO from Lebanon. With the PLO's evacuation from Beirut, the Palestinian cause appeared to have been gravely weakened, and Sharon seemed to have achieved all of his core objectives. However, the paradoxical result of these events was gradually to shift the center of gravity of the Palestinian national movement away from the neighboring Arab countries, where it had been relaunched in the 1950s and 1960s, moving it back inside Palestine. It was there that the First Intifada broke out 5 years later in December 1987, with results that shook both Israeli and world public opinion. As the Nakba had done decades earlier, the stinging defeat produced a new and different form of resistance by the Palestinians to the multi-pronged war being waged against them. Sharon and Begin had launched the invasion to defeat the PLO and demoralize the Palestinians, thereby freeing Israel to absorb the occupied territories. But the end result was to spur their resistance and relocate it inside Palestine. As for those who played a key part in the events of the summer of 1982, for many of them, misgivings and regrets seemed to dominate their recollections. In interviews with me in 1983 and 84, Morris Draper and Robert Dillon, the U.S. ambassador to Lebanon at the time, expressed deep remorse for their role in the negotiations with the PLO. Both felt bitterly deceived by Sharon and Begin, who they said had given the United States explicit commitments that Israeli forces would not enter West Beirut. Philip Habib pulled no punches, saying that his government had been deceived not only by Israel, but also by its own Secretary of State. Quote, Haig was lying. Sharon was lying, unquote, he said to me. The recently released Israeli documents confirm that a great deal of deception and perhaps even more self-deception were going on in Beirut, Washington, and Jerusalem in the spring and summer of 1982. Senior French diplomats I interviewed who were involved in the negotiations over the PLO's evacuation from Lebanon expressed regrets about their failure to get a better deal. They were bitter about their inability to obtain international security guarantees for the Palestinian civilian population and for the long-term stationing of multinational forces to protect the Palestinian civilian population. They regretted the United States' unilateral handling of negotiations and its efforts to restrict the involvement of international representatives. At the time, they had warned repeatedly and presciently that the course being followed by the United States would lead to a tragic outcome. But in the end, the French government did nothing to prevent it. With the PLO, its leaders were angry at the betrayal by the United States, which had failed to protect the camps. They expressed sorrow and even a sense of guilt at not having secured ironclad guarantees for the safety of those they left behind. Abu Iyad, who had argued throughout the siege for a tougher negotiating position, explicitly charged the PLO leadership with failing its own people, a judgment that was shared by many Palestinians. A few others held similar opinions, beyond expressing deep regret at the outcome. Abu Jihad Khalil al-Wazir was otherwise taciturn and unrevealing. Unsurprisingly, Arafat was the least self-critical. For the United States, its insistence on monopolizing Middle East diplomacy and its furtherance of Israel's ambitions did not serve American interests well. This was glaringly attested to the subsequent events, which included the suicide bombings of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, the U.S. Marines barracks, and of the French troops, who had returned to an ill-defined mission in the city soon after Sabra and Shatila massacres. Within months, the battleship USS New Jersey was firing shells the size of Volkswagen Beetles into the Shuf Mountains, where Druze militias, supported by Syria, were battling the LF, supported by Israel, and the United States became embroiled in a shooting war that few Americans, including many of those directly involved, fully understood. Hezbollah, which grew out of the Lebanese maelstrom, became a deadly foe of the United States and Israel. In considering its rise, few have noted that many of the young men who founded the movement and carried out its lethal attacks on American and Israeli targets had fought alongside the PLO in 1982. They had remained after the PLO fighters left, only to see hundreds of their fellow Shiites massacred alongside the Palestinians in Sabra and Shatila. The people killed in the U.S. Embassy bombing, the Marines who died in their barracks, and the many other Americans kidnapped or assassinated in Beirut, among them Malcolm Kerr and several of my colleagues and friends at the AUB, largely victims of attacks by the groups that became Hezbollah, paid the price for the perceived collusion between their country and the Israeli occupier. Within Fulman's circles of responsibility, the Lebanese, who were directly and indirectly responsible for the massacres, paid perhaps the highest price. Bashir Gimael and his lieutenant Eli Hobika were both assassinated, as were several others, and the senior LF leader and eventually president of the political party it became, Samir Giaggia, spent 11 years in prison for crimes committed during the Lebanese War, although not for any related to the 1982 invasion. Of the PLO leaders who made the fateful decisions that led to the tragedy in Sabra and Shatila, Abu Jihad and Abu Iyad were both assassinated, the former by Israel and the latter probably by an Iraqi agent. Arafat died after being besieged by Israeli troops in his headquarters in Ramallah. None of them was ever held responsible for the outcomes of the 1982 war. I really wanted to say were, but it's was. Most of the Israeli decision makers involved, including Begin, Sharon, and several senior generals, endured humiliation or loss of office as a result of the Kahan Commission report and the condemnation within Israel following the massacres. However, none of them suffered criminal penalties or any other serious sanction. Indeed, the head of Israel's Northern Command, Major General Amir Drury, who was in charge of the invasion forces, served out his term in command and then went off for a year's study leave in Washington, D.C. Both Shamir and Sharon, as well as Netanyahu, went on to serve as prime ministers of Israel. By contrast, none of the American officials involved were ever held responsible for any of their acts, whether their collusion with Israel in launching and waging the 1982 war or the failure of the United States to honor its pledges regarding the security of Palestinian civilians. Many of them, including Reagan, Haig, and Habib, are now dead. All have so far escaped judgment. Chapter 5, The Fifth Declaration of War, 1987 to 1995. They make a desert and call it peace. Tacitus. The Palestinian uprising, or Intifada, which broke out in December 1987, was a perfect example of the law of unintended consequences. Ariel Sharon and Menachem Begin had launched the invasion of Lebanon to quash the power of the PLO and thereby end Palestinian nationalist opposition in the occupied West Bank and Gaza to the absorption of those territories into Israel. This would complete the colonial task of historic Zionism, creating a Jewish state in all of Palestine. The 1982 war did succeed in weakening the PLO, but the paradoxical effect was to strengthen the Palestinian national movement in Palestine itself, shifting the focus of action from outside to inside the country. After 2 decades of a relatively manageable occupation, Begin and Sharon, 2 fervent partisans of the Greater Israel ideal, had inadvertently sparked a new level of resistance to the process of colonization. Opposition to Israel's land grab and military rule has erupted within Palestine repeatedly and in different forms ever since. The First Intifada, as it became known, erupted spontaneously all over the occupied territories, ignited when an Israeli army vehicle struck a truck in the Jabalia refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, killing 4 Palestinians. The uprising spread very quickly, although Gaza was under the crucible and remained the most difficult area for Israel to bring under control. The Intifada generated extensive local organization in village, towns, cities, and refugee camps, and came to be led by a secret unified national leadership. The flexible and clandestine grassroots networks formed during the Intifada proved impossible for the military occupation authorities to suppress. After a month of escalating unrest, in January 1988, Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin ordered the security forces to use, quote, force, might, and beatings, unquote. His, quote, iron fist policy, unquote, was carried out through the explicit practice of breaking the demonstrators' arms and legs and cracking their skulls, as well as beating others who aroused the soldiers' ire. Within a short time, widely televised images of heavily armed soldiers brutalizing teenage Palestinian protesters created a major media backlash in the United States and elsewhere, showing Israel in its true light as a callous occupying power. Only 5 years after the media coverage of the siege and bombing of Beirut, this exposure dealt another blow to the image of a country largely dependent on complacent American public opinion. In spite of the harmful impact of the 1982 war on Israel's standing, the country's shrewd public relations efforts had succeeded in re-anthesizing. Let me reread this. Anesthetizing. In spite of the harmful impact of the 1982 war on Israel's standing, the country's shrewd public relations efforts had succeeded in re-anesthetizing much of the U.S. public opinion. But unlike the televised air and artillery bombardments of Lebanon, which ended after 10 weeks, the violence of the Intifada ground on. Year after brutal year, from December 1987 through 1993, winding down somewhat during the Gulf War and Peace Conference organized by the United States in Madrid in October 1991. During this time, the uprising produced gripping scenes of street battles between young Palestinian protesters and Israeli troops who were supported by armored peace personnel carriers and tanks. The iconic image from this period was of a small Palestinian boy hurling a stone at a huge Israeli tank. If it bleeds, it leads, the saying goes, and the television viewers were riveted by repeated tableaus of wrenching violence, which inverted the image of Israel as a perpetual victim, casting it as Goliath against the Palestinian David. This was a constant drain on Israel, not only in terms of the pressure on its security forces, but also, and perhaps more significant, in terms of its reputation abroad. In some ways, its most vital asset. Even Rabin, the man in charge, realized the importance of this political factor. A flattering New York Times interview with Rabin opened by claiming that, quote, Palestinian rioters have been winning the public relations battle against Israel in the world press. Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin conceded today, stressing that the army is confronting something new and complex, a widespread uprising born of decades of Palestinian frustrations, unquote. At that time that the First Intifada broke out, the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip had been in place for 2 decades. Taking advantage of a situation of relative calm, Israel began the colonization of the occupied territories immediately after the 1967 war, eventually creating over 200 settlements from cities of 50,000 residents to flimsy prefabricated clusters housing a few dozen settlers. For years, Israeli experts had assured their leaders and the public that the Palestinians living under what they called an enlightened occupation were content and fully under control. The eruption of mass grassroots resistance belied this notion. It was true that some Palestinians, intimidated by Israeli might and by a round of mass expulsions of more than 250,000 of their number after the 1967 war, had seemed to acquiesce at first to the new order imposed on them. It was also true that incomes in the West Bank and Gaza Strip rose significantly as tens of thousands of Palestinians were newly allowed to work in Israel. By 1976, however, alienation had intensified. Any expression of nationalism, flying the Palestinian flag, displaying the Palestinian colors, organizing trade unions, voicing support for the PLO, or any other resistance organization, was severely suppressed with fines, beatings, and jail. Detentions and imprisonment usually featured torture of detainees. Protesting the occupation publicly or in print could lead to the same result or even to deportation. More active resistance, especially that involving violence, invited collective punishment, house demolitions, imprisonment without trial under the rubric of administrative detention that could last for years, and even extrajudicial murder. That year, mayoral candidates backed by the PLO won municipal elections in Nablus, Ramallah, Hebron, and Al-Bireh, as well as in other towns. A number of the mayors were deported in 1980, accused of incitement, and others were removed from office by the military occupation authorities in the spring of 1982, provoking widespread unrest. This was done in the lead up to the invasion of Lebanon as part of Ariel Sharon's comprehensive campaign to uproot the PLO. One aspect of that campaign was an attempt to create local collaborationist groups, the Village Leagues, a project that never got off the ground because of widespread Palestinian refusal to cooperate with the occupation after the mayor's removal. Sharon's chosen instrument for this policy was a so-called Israeli Arabist, Menachem Milson, a professor of Arabic and a reserve colonel in the Israeli army. For a person to wear these two hats was not unusual. Most senior academic Middle East specialists in Israel doubled as reserve officers in military intelligence or other branches of the security services. Engaged in spying on and oppressing the people they studied the rest of the time. Meanwhile, a new generation of Palestinians had come of age, having known nothing but military occupation, and they were anything but acquiescent. These young people came out in public expressions of support for the PLO in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, in spite of the risk of doing so. The years preceding the Intifada were marked by mass demonstrations by young Palestinians, more fearless than their elders, and by intensifying repression by Israeli security forces, whose superiors seemed heedless of the cumulative effect of the brutality they were ordering. Given all the signs of growing unrest, the uprising should have come as no surprise to the Israeli authorities. Yet their swift response was ill-conceived, heavy-handed, and disproportionate. The systematic brutality of the soldiers, most of them young draftees, toward the population they were charged with controlling was not only the result of frustration or even fear. Rabin's orders to, quote, break bones, unquote, set the tone, but the excessive violence was also rooted in constant societal anti-Palestinian indoctrination, grounded in the dogmatic idea that Israel would be overwhelmed by the Arabs if its security forces did not deter them by force, since their supposedly irrational hostility to Jews was otherwise uncontrollable. Okay. Chapter 5, Note 9. Quote, Colonel says Rabin ordered breaking of Palestinian bones, unquote. Reuters, cited in the LA Times, June 22nd, 1990. In his biography, Yitzhak Rabin, soldier, leader, statesman, pages 156-57, Itamar Rabinovich denies the accuracy of that quote, while admitting that Rabin, quote, clearly was the author of a policy that sought to defeat the Intifada through the use of force, unquote. The Intifada had been underway for nearly a year and a half when I took my first trip to Palestine since 1966, at which time the West Bank had been under Jordanian rule. On a trip 2 years later on a Fulbright fellowship, I was denied entry into Israel. After many hours of detention, I was allowed to enter due to the intercession of the U.S. Consul General in Tel Aviv, who had been forewarned of my arrival by the State Department. During a visit to Nablus with some University of Chicago colleagues, after leaving my cousin Ziad's home one evening, we found ourselves in the winding streets of the old city, caught in a clash between young protesters and the Israeli troops who were chasing them, firing rubber bullets and tear gas. The soldiers did not catch any of the demonstrators, but they did eventually manage to disperse them. It was clear at that moment that there could be no lasting victory for Israel's forces in this kind of cat-and-mouse urban unrest. The young protesters could reappear at any moment somewhere else in the labyrinth of narrow alleys. Of course, the troops could simply kill them, and that happened all too frequently. From the beginning of the First Intifada to the end of 1996, 9 years, including 6 when the Intifada was ongoing, Israeli troops and armed settlers killed 1,422 Palestinians, almost one every other day. Of them, 294, or over 20%, were minors 16 and under. 175 Israelis, 86 of them security personnel, were killed by Palestinians during the same period. That 8-to-1 casualty ratio is typical, something one would not have known from much of the American media coverage. On another occasion, I was driving through Gaza City on the way to visit my cousin Huda, wife of Dr. Haidar, Abd al-Shafi, head of the Palestinian Red Crescent in Gaza. In the slow crawl of a traffic jam, our car passed a heavily armed Israeli patrol. The soldiers in the Jeep, holding their weapons at the ready, they were fidgety and nervous, and in their faces I saw a quality I had noticed in the Israeli troops in occupied Beirut in 1982. They were afraid. Their vehicles moved at a snail's pace through heavily populated, built-up areas, where the entire community loathed the occupation that the soldiers embodied and enforced. Soldiers of a regular army, no matter how heavily armed, will never feel secure in such circumstances. Rabin and others recognized the inherent problems that I saw on the streets of Nablus and Gaza. According to Itamar Rabinovich, Rabin's biographer, close collaborator, and tennis partner, the First Intifada brought the veteran general to the realization that a political solution was necessary. Rabinovich, Yitzhak Rabin, pages 157-58. Nonetheless, he held fast to the deterrent effect of brutality, quote, the use of force, unquote. Rabin said, quote, including beatings, undoubtedly has brought about the impact we wanted, strengthening the population's fear of the Israel Defense Forces, unquote. Maybe so, but this brutality did not put an end to the uprising. The Intifada was a spontaneous, bottom-up campaign of resistance, born of an accumulation of frustration and initially with no connection to the formal political Palestinian leadership. As with the 1936 through 1939 revolt, the Intifada's length and extensive support was proof of the broad popular backing that it enjoyed. The uprising was also flexible and innovative, developing a coordinated leadership while remaining locally driven and controlled. Among its activists were men and women, elite professionals and business people, farmers, villagers, the urban poor, students, small shopkeepers, and members of virtually every other sector of society. Women played a central role, taking more and more leadership positions, as many of the men were jailed and mobilizing people who were often left out of conventional male-dominated politics. Along with demonstrations, the Intifada involved tactics ranging from strikes, boycotts, and withholding taxes to other ingenious forms of civil disobedience. Protests sometimes turned violent, often ignited by soldiers inflicting heavy casualties with live ammunition and rubber bullets used against unarmed demonstrators or youths throwing stones. Nevertheless, the uprising was predominantly nonviolent and unarmed, a crucially important factor that helps mobilize sectors of society in addition to the young people protesting in the streets, while showing that the entirety of Palestinian society under occupation opposed the status quo and supported the Intifada. The First Intifada was an outstanding example of popular resistance against oppression and can be considered as being the first unmitigated victory for the Palestinians in the long colonial war that began in 1917. Unlike the 1936-1939 revolt, the Intifada was driven by a broad strategic vision and a unified leadership, and it did not exacerbate internal Palestinian divisions. This is getting difficult. Here we go. 15. As we have seen, in spite of the divisions it engendered, the revolt effected extensive social and political transformations before it was crushed by 100,000 British troops, backed by their Zionist auxiliaries, as well as the heavy use of air power. See the remarkable article by Charles Anderson, quote, State Formation from Below, unquote. Its unifying effect in the largely successful avoidance of firearms and explosives, in contrast to the Palestinian resistance movement of the 1960s and 1970s, helped to make its appeal widely heard internationally, leading to a profound and lasting positive impact on both Israeli and world public opinion. This was no accident. The Intifada was explicitly aimed not only at mobilizing Palestinians and Arabs, but also at shaping Israeli and world perceptions. That this was a key objective was clear from many of the tactics used, and also from the sophisticated and effective communication strategies of those who were able to explain to international audiences what the Intifada meant. These included articulate and worldly activists and intellectuals inside Palestine, such as Hanan Ashrawi, Haidar Abd al-Shafi, Raja Shahida, Ayad al-Sarraj, Ghassan al-Khatib, Zahira Kamal, Mustafa Barghouti, Rita Giacoman, Raji Surani, and many others. Those outside of Palestine, among them Edward Said and Ibrahim Ibn Luqad, had a similar impact. By the early 1990s, the unified Palestinian stance had successfully made it clear that the occupation was untenable, at least it had functioned in its first 2 decades. For all of the First Intifada's achievements, there was a hidden internal danger in its success and in the emergence of an effective local leadership with articulate, attractive spokespersons. A grassroots movement that supersedes established political elites constitutes a challenge to their power. After the PLO's defeat in Lebanon in 1982, the organization was stuck in a sterile and debilitating exile in Tunis and other Arab capitals, with its energy directed at an initially fruitless attempt to win U.S. acceptance as an interlocutor and Israeli acceptance as partner to a settlement. The PLO was taken by surprise by the outbreak of a grassroots-led uprising and lost no time trying to co-opt and profit from it. Since most of those who had risen up in revolt in the occupied territories saw the PLO as their legitimate representative and its leaders as the embodiment of Palestinian nationalism, this posed few problems at the outset. The population of the occupied territories, who had watched from a distance the sacrifices of the PLO's militants in Jordan during Black September and in Lebanon throughout the Civil War and the Israeli invasion, felt they were now shouldering part of the national burden. They were proud that Palestinians under occupation were taking the lead in the struggle for liberation. The problem with this development was the short-sightedness and limited strategic vision of the PLO's leaders in Tunis. Many of them did not fully understand the nature of the occupation regime or the complex social and political situation of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip after 2 decades of Israeli control. Indeed, most of these leaders had not been inside Palestine since 1967 or earlier. Their understanding of Israeli society and politics was far more limited than the Palestinians who lived under and watched Israeli rule, many of whom had learned Hebrew in their jobs inside Israel or while serving time in prison. A fifth of the Palestinian population under occupation had passed through these prisons. The consequence was increasingly intrusive management of the Intifada by remote control from Tunis as the PLO came to dominate what had been a popular resistance movement. It issued directives and ran things from a distance, often ignoring the views and preferences of those who had initiated the revolt and had led successfully. This problem became considerably more acute after Israel's assassination of Abu Jihad in April 1988, some 4 months after the Intifada began. Abu Jihad, Arafat's closest lieutenant, had been a leading figure in Fatah since the beginning and had long been in charge of dealing with the occupied territories, or, as his department was called, Al-Qita al-Gharbi, the Western Sector, presumably to conceal its true purpose. Abu Jihad had his failings, but he was a close observer of the situation inside Palestine and was deeply knowledgeable about both Palestinians and Israelis there. His assassination, which was a result of the Israeli leadership's mounting frustration at their inability to master the Intifada, deprived the PLO of one of its key figures, whose role could not easily be filled by another. Bergman, Rise and Kill First. Pages 311 through 333 says that Abu Jihad's role in the Intifada was the main reason he was killed, noting on page 323 that some senior Israeli officials later recognized that, quote, the assassination failed to reach its goal, unquote, of dampening the Intifada, and that for these and other reasons, they came to feel that his killing had been a mistake. Abu Jihad's killing was part of Israel's decades-long policy of systematic liquidation of top Palestinian organizers, particularly the effective ones among them. Abid, pages 316 to 317. Reports that the planners of the operation to kill Abu Jihad deliberately decided to forego assassinating Mahmoud Abbas Abu Mazin, whose home was nearby. Many Palestinians have long suspected that only those perceived by the Israeli security services as outstanding advocates of the Palestinian cause were targeted for liquidation, implying that others were not worth the effort to kill them. The loss of Abu Jihad and the lack of expertise in Tunis was not the only reason for the PLO's problems in dealing with the Intifada. Following the 1982 war, Fatah had weathered a major Syrian-sponsored mutiny among its remaining cadres in northern and eastern Lebanon, from which they had not been evacuated in 1982, and in Syria, led by two senior military commanders, Colonel Abu Musa and Colonel Abu Khalid al-Amli. This was the most serious internal challenge to Fatah's leadership since its founding, and it constituted another element in the largely covert offensive against the Palestinian national movement carried out by the Arab regimes, in this case, Syria. The virulence of the rivalry between Syria and the PLO can be discerned from the claim by Bergman, Ibid, 304, that undercover Israeli intelligence agents, posing as dissident Palestinians, covertly passed information on PLO operatives to the Syrian intelligence station in Cyprus. The Syrian security services then got rid of about 150 PLO people, who were liquidated upon their arrival in Lebanon. The Fatah mutiny was bitter and costly and intensified the concern of Arafat and his colleagues about the emergence of rivals, especially those under the influence of hostile regimes. The concern was well-founded, given the efforts by the movement's adversaries to create alternatives, such as village leagues in the occupied territories. Notably, Hamas, founded in 1987 and initially discreetly supported by Israel, with the objective of weakening the PLO. For details, see Richard Sale, quote, Israel gave major aid to Hamas, unquote, UPI, February 24, 2001. And Michel and Avraham Sila, the Palestinian Hamas, Vision, Violence, and Coexistence, New York Columbia University Press, 2000. These well-connected Israeli authors make it clear that dividing Palestinian ranks was the aim of the Israeli security establishment and encouraging the rise of the Islamist rival to the PLO. Okay, back here. Hamas, founded in 1987, was already beginning to develop into a formidable competitor. This alarm at the possibility of being superseded was at the root of the PLO's leadership's jealousy of the Intifada's local leaders, especially as their following grew within Palestine and the global media came to view them positively. Arafat's resentment became an increasing problem as the Intifada progressed and as the PLO's long-desired prize, a place at international negotiations as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, appeared to come within its reach. Just as they had a weak understanding of the reality inside the occupied territories in Israel, the PLO's leaders had never grasped the full measure of the United States. Even after 1982, they remained ill-informed about the country and its politics, with the exception of a few second-rank figures such as Nabil Shahith and Elias Shufani, who had been educated in the United States but were unable to influence Arafat and his partners. After the 1982 war, Shufani joined the Syrian-backed Fatah rebels opposing Arafat's leadership. Some senior PLO leaders, such as Farouk al-Kaddoumi, Abu Lutif, head of the political department, effectively foreign minister, attended sessions of the UN General Assembly in New York every fall, but they are legally restricted to a travel radius of 25 miles from Columbus Circle. In any case, they mostly stayed put in their luxury hotels for the duration of their visits. They ventured out infrequently to see Arab diplomats or to speak to Palestinian community groups, but made few public appearances and did not engage with American groups or the New York media. They certainly never undertook the all-points diplomatic and public relations campaigns of Israel officials who were ubiquitous on TV and at regional gatherings at all times, especially when the annual meetings of the General Assembly came around. The failure to take advantage of the Palestinian presence at the UN amounted to willfully ignoring the people, the elites, and the media of the greatest power on earth and the mainstay of Israel, an approach that dated back to 1948 and before. As I saw in 1984, Arafat gave more importance to meeting the leader of a minor PLO faction linked to Iraq than to listening to expert advice about swaying public opinion in the United States. The situation had not improved since then. A simplistic view of the structures of government and decision-making in Washington led to the PLO to pin all its hopes on winning the U.S. government's recognition as a legitimate Palestinian interlocutor. American good offices for a failed deal with the Israelis would surely follow. This attitude carried a trace of the naive faith of earlier generations of Palestinian leaders, shared by many Arab rulers to this day, that a personal appeal to a British colonial secretary or prime minister, a U.S. secretary of state or president, could solve the problem. This illusory view of the personal element in power relations may have been grounded in the experience of dealing with mercurial, all-powerful dictators and absolute monarchs in the Arab world. It was also partly shaped by the experience of the Arab monarchs who saw U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz, who headed Bechtel, a major contractor in the Gulf, and later President George H.W. Bush and his Secretary of State James Baker, Texans with past links to the oil industry, as, quote, pro-Arab, unquote. Indeed, as with most other U.S. policymakers since Roosevelt, these men were closely tied to the Arab petro-monarchies. But this did not translate to sympathy for the Arabs generally, or for the Palestinians in particular, or into critical attitude toward Israel. These flawed understandings were at the root of the PLO's failure to engage seriously with U.S. public opinion and became involved in peace negotiations through the late 1980s. However, in 1988, buoyed by the international impact of the Intifada, the organization redoubled its efforts, culminating in the Palestinian Declaration of Independence adopted at a meeting of the Palestine National Council in Algiers on November 15th. Drafted largely by Mahmoud Darwish, who was aided by Edward Said and the respected intellectual Shafiq al-Hout, the document formally abandoned the PLO's claim to the entirety of Palestine, accepting the principles of partition, a two-state solution, and a peaceful resolution to the conflict. An accompanying political communique accepted SC-242 and SC-338 as the basis for a peace conference. These were major political shifts for the PLO, the culmination of an evolution toward acceptance of Israel and advocacy of Palestinian state alongside it that had begun in the early 1970s, although these changes were unacknowledged by its Israeli adversaries. A more significant shift was yet to come. On December 14th that year, Arafat accepted U.S. conditions for entering a bilateral dialogue. In his statement, he He explicitly accepted resolutions 242 and 338, recognized the right of Israel to exist in peace and security, and renounced terrorism. Quote, statement by Yasser Arafat, 14 December 1988, unquote. Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Historical Documents, 1984 to 1988. Where were we? This capitulation to American conditions finally obtained for the PLO the long-sought opening with Washington, but it neither moved the Israelis to agree to deal with the organization nor lead to peace negotiations, at least not for 3 more years. The reasons for this were simple. Beyond the PLO's other misassumptions about the United States, its leaders failed to grasp the lack of American concern, even its disdain for their interests and aims. This incomprehension is hard to fathom in light of the painful betrayal of the American promises to safeguard the refugee camps in Beirut in 1982. Most important, though, was their inability to understand how intimately the policies of the United States and Israel were linked. Kissinger's secret 1975 commitments locked U.S. policymakers' feet in cement where dealing with the Palestine question was concerned. The PLO might not have known that Israel had effectively secured veto power over a U.S. position in any peace talks. FRUS 26, Arab-Israeli dispute, 1974 to 76, Washington, D.C., U.S. Government Printing Office, 2012, pages 838 to 840, 831 to 832. Also, you can go online. History.state.gov/historical documents /FRUS 1969-76V26. Okay. But there have been enough credible leaks in the press and elsewhere about these secret agreements, mainly from Israelis who were understandably eager to publicize them. While, as we saw in Chapter 4, the Ford letter to Rabin was published by the Israeli Foreign Ministry in its Israel's Foreign Relations Selected Documents series in 1982, and was thereafter available online on the ministry website. It is never mentioned in Kissinger's voluminous memoirs, and the U.S. government only published it in the Foreign Relations of the United States series in 2012, 30 years later. There had also been embarrassing incidents, as when Andrew Young, ambassador to the UN, was forced to resign after meeting with a PLO official. The general terms of United States commitments to Israel should have been clear to an informed observer. This Arafat and his colleagues definitely were not. The Intifada had delivered to them a gift of inestimable value, a store of moral and political capital. The popular revolt had revealed the limits of the military occupation, damaged Israel's international standing, and improved that of the Palestinians. For all that effectiveness of the PLO in its first decades in putting Palestine back on the global map, it can be argued that the Intifada had a more positive impact on world opinion than the organization's generally ineffective efforts at armed struggle ever had. Director of the Mossad at the time, Nahum Admoni, confirmed this, saying, quote, "The Intifada caused us a lot more political harm, damage to our image, than everything that the PLO had succeeded in doing throughout its existence," unquote. Trading on this significant new asset enabled the PLO leadership to abandon firmly its strategy of armed struggle from bases outside Palestine, which in any case was increasingly impossible after 1982, and in their hands had much chance of success if it was not actually harmful to the Palestinian cause. Even before 1982, many in the PLO understood that the time had come to end the armed struggle. While still based in Lebanon, its leaders had tasked the distinguished Pakistani intellectual Iqbal Ahmed, a close friend of Edward Said and a friend of mine, with assessing their military strategy. Ahmad had worked with the Front de Libération Nationale in Algeria in the early 1960s, had known Frantz Fanon, and was a renowned Third World anti-colonial thinker. After visiting PLO bases in South Lebanon, he returned with a critique that disconcerted those who had asked his advice. While in principle a committed supporter of armed struggle against colonial regimes such as that in Algeria, Ahmad had strong criticisms of the ineffective and often counterproductive way in which the PLO was carrying out the strategy. More seriously, on political rather than moral or legal grounds, he questioned whether armed struggle was the right course of action against the PLO's particular adversary, Israel. He argued that given the course of Jewish history, especially in the 20th century, the use of force only strengthened a pre-existing pervasive sense of victimhood among Israelis, while it unified Israeli society, reinforced the most militant tendencies in Zionism, and bolstered the support of external actors. I heard about this advice, embodied in a memo whose text I had been unable to find, from Ahmed himself and from others. Some of these themes can be found in selections in Carolee Bengelsdorf, Margaret Cerullo, and Yogesh Sharandi editions, The Selected Writings of Iqbal Ahmed, New York, Columbia University Press, 2006, pages 77 through 78, pages 296, 297. This was in distinction to Algeria, where the FLN's use of violence, including women using, quote, baskets to carry bombs, which have taken so many innocent lives, unquote, in the accusatory words of a French interrogator in the 1966 Gio Pontecorvo film, The Battle of Algiers, ultimately succeeded in dividing French society and eroding its support for the colonial project. Ahmad's critique was profound and devastating, and not welcomed by the PLO's leaders, who still publicly proclaimed a devotion to armed struggle, even as they were moving away from its practice. Beyond his acute understanding of the deep connection between Zionism and the long history of persecution of Jews in Europe, Ahmad's analysis shrewdly perceived the unique nature of the Israeli colonial project. In a letter to a comrade on September 17, 1982, Ahmad later gave the PLO the same advice, while he called for a, quote, armed underground resistance, unquote, to Israeli occupation forces in Lebanon and occupied Palestine. He advocated, quote, militant and creative organization of nonviolent political struggle, unquote. A copy of letter in my possession, courtesy of Nubar of Sipien. See also Ahmed's analysis along these lines in, quote, Pioneering in the Nuclear Age, an essay on Israel and the Palestinians, unquote. The Selected Writings of Iqbal Ahmed, pages 298 through 317. The mainly nonviolent intifada in Palestine enabled Arafat to take account, albeit belatedly, of Ahmed's view, and at the same time to respond positively to a prime U.S. condition for dialogue, renouncing armed resistance deemed to be terrorism by the United States and Israel. However, the results of the PLO's naivety regarding the United States soon became apparent. in and of themselves, recognition by the United States and a seat at the negotiating table were unexceptionable aims. Every anti-colonial movement, whether in Algeria, Vietnam, or South Africa, desired its foes to accept its legitimacy and to negotiate with it for an honorable end to the conflict. In all these cases, however, an honorable outcome meant ending occupation and colonization and ideally reaching a peaceful reconciliation based on justice. That was the primary object of the negotiations sought by other liberation movements. But instead of using the Intifada's success to hold out for a forum framed in terms of such liberatory ends, the PLO allowed itself to be drawn into a process explicitly designed by Israel, with the acquiescence of the United States, to prolong its occupation and colonization, not to end them. The PLO desperately pursued admission to supposed peace negotiations whose narrow parameters were, from the outset, restricted by SC 242 in ways that were enormously disadvantageous to the Palestinians. SC 242 includes no mention of the Palestine question or of the Arab state specified in UNGA Resolution 181 in 1947, or of the return of refugees mandated by the UNGA Resolution 194 of 1948. With a carefully drafted wording without withdrawal from, quote, territories occupied, unquote, in 1967, rather than, quote, the territories occupied, unquote, 242 effectively gave Israel a chance to expand its pre-1967 borders further. Whether they realized it or not, by accepting Resolution 242 as the basis for any negotiations, Arafat and his colleagues had set themselves an impossible task. They also failed to understand the need to continue to put pressure on one's adversaries. With the end of armed struggle in the waning of the Intifada in the early 1990s, this became less and less possible. Once talks finally began in Madrid in the fall of 1991, the PLO tried to put a halt to the Intifada. It did not stop, but petered out a few years later, as if launching negotiations were the end of the process rather than the beginning. Added to the fact the United States could never be an honest broker given the commitments it had undertaken, Israel also had its own independent positions. Thus, any concessions made by the PLO to the United States did not necessarily bind Israel or make it willing to deal with the organization. In fact, when at the end of the Reagan administration, the United States finally began a dialogue with the PLO following its 1988 declaration, Israel became even more transient. Furthermore, the PLO did not seem to comprehend the full import of the 1978 Camp David deal and subsequent 1979 Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, in which Menachem Begin had struck a ruinous bargain over Palestine with Anwar Sadat and Jimmy Carter. Also, the decline of the USSR meant that the PLO lost an intermittent and inconsistent patron that had provided military and diplomatic support and had championed its inclusion in negotiations under far less onerous terms than those demanded by the United States and Israel. This was true although 1947 Moscow had been one of the midwives of the partition and of the resulting creation of Israel, whose existence it consistently supported thereafter, and had supported UNSC 242, which consecrated Israel's victories of both 1948 and 1967. The Soviets were initially suspicious of the PLO's adventurism and its potential for dragging its Egyptian and Syrian clients and the USSR into conflict they did not want. By the end of 1991, however, the USSR had disappeared, and the United States was left as the sole international guarantor and sponsor of any Palestinian-Israeli process. Another grave blow to the PLO's standing was the profound miscalculation by Yasser Arafat and most of his colleagues regarding the 1990 1991 Gulf War. Almost immediately after Iraq's invasion and occupation of Kuwait in August 1990, the Gulf states, together with virtually every other major Arab power, including Egypt and Syria, joined the U.S.-led international coalition to forcibly reverse Saddam Hussein's gross violation of the sovereignty of a member state of the Arab League. This was in keeping with the consistent preference of post-colonial states in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East for the preservation of colonial borders in the states that had grown up within them. Instead of firmly supporting Kuwait against Iraq, Arafat tried to steer a, quote, neutral, unquote, course, offering to mediate between the two states. His suggestion was ignored by all concerned, as were the mediating efforts of more powerful actors such as the USSR, which fruitlessly sent its senior Middle East envoy to Baghdad. For Primakov's account of his effort to avert a war and save one of the last remaining Soviet clients from the folly of its leader, see Missions à Baghdad, Histoire d'une négociation secrète, Paris, Sale, 1991. Immediately afterwards, Primakov became head of the KGB's Foreign Operations Directorate, and after the dissolution of the USSR, served as Russian Foreign Intelligence Chief, Foreign Minister, and Prime Minister. There were multiple reasons for the PLO's bizarre decision to essentially support Iraq, a move that made the organization a pariah among the Gulf states on which it depended for financial support and harmed it in innumerable other ways. First, among these reasons, was Arafat's long-standing and fierce antipathy toward Hafez al-Assad's overbearing Syrian regime, an antipathy that was richly reciprocated, and his reflexive search for a counterweight. One of Arafat's signature slogans, quote, al-Qarar al-Fastani al-Mustaqil, the independent Palestinian decision, unquote, was usually brandished in response to Syrian efforts to coerce, constrain, and dominate the PLO. While Egypt had once served to balance the pressures exerted by the Assad regime, that role was no longer possible after Sadat's separate peace with Israel. The only other plausible counterweight had of necessity been Syria's revival, Iraq. In the wake of Sadat's apostasy, the PLO had become increasingly dependent on Iraqi political, military, and financial patronage, especially after the Syrian regime sought to undermine Arafat's leadership by masterminding the fratricidal rebellion against him in 1982. This dependency subjected Arafat and the PLO to intense pressure to conform to Iraqi policies, which were dictated by the vagaries of Saddam Hussein, a thuggish despot who was ignorant, mercurial, and brutal. To keep the PLO in line, the Iraqi regime frequently punished it. Among the many tools for this purpose, Baghdad had at its disposal variously nominally Palestinian splinter groups like the Abu Nidal's terrorist network, the Ba'athist Arab Liberation Front, and the Palestine Liberation Front, headed by Abu al-Abbas. All these tiny groups lacked a popular base and were essentially extensions of the fearsome Iraqi intelligence services. Although, as we have seen, Abu Nidal's guns for hire were also at times clandestinely employed by the Libyan and Syrian regimes and were deeply penetrated by other intelligence services. Any one of them could carry out operations designed to undermine the PLO or attack its leaders to force it back into line with the Iraqi regime. Indeed, for a time, Abu Nidal's gunmen murdered almost as many PLO envoys and leaders in Europe as did the Mossad. These fronts for several Arab regimes also specialized in spectacular terror operations against Israeli and Jewish civilians, such as Abu Nidal Group's 1985 Rome and Vienna airport massacres, and its bloody 1986 assault on an Istanbul synagogue, or the PLF's 1985 attack on a Keelora cruise liner. Their dependency on Iraq apart, Arafat and his others wildly overestimated Iraqi military capacities in 1990 and 1991. They had an inflated judgment of Iraq's ability to withstand the onslaught of the US-led coalition that was clearly coming after the invasion of Kuwait. This delusional view, Iraq had been unable to defeat Iran in 8 years of war, was widespread in various parts of the Arab world. In the months before the inevitable US-led counteroffensive began, otherwise intelligent, well-informed people in Palestine, Lebanon, and Jordan loudly pronounced their certainty that war would not come. But if it did, Iraq would prevail. Arafat was in some measure carried along by a popular tide, as large segments of Arabic public opinion shared his fantasy. Many supported Saddam Hussein's land grab as a nationalist blow against, quote, colonial imposed frontiers, unquote, as if most of the frontiers and states in the Arab East had not also been colonial imposed. Saddam was seen by those thus deluded as a great Arab hero, a new Saladin. The original Saladin had come from the Tikrit, Hussein's birthplace, who could surely defeat the United States and its allies. The one exception to the PLO's consensus of idiocy was its intelligence chief, Abu Iyad, among the brightest and most grounded of its senior leaders. He understood that the chosen course would lead to disaster and fought fiercely against the decision to back Iraq, provoking tempestuous arguments with Arafat, as well as the obvious reasons for his stance. He was concerned with safeguarding the prosperous Palestinian community in Kuwait, which was several 100,000 strong. Both he and Arafat had lived and worked in Kuwait for years, and he had close ties to the community, which furnished one of the PLO's most solid, popular, and financial bases anywhere in the world. Moreover, Kuwait itself was supportive toward the PLO and was the only Arab country where Palestinians had relative freedom of expression. They ran their own schools and could organize to help the PLO as long as they took care not to interfere in Kuwait politics. Abu Iyad argued that Arafat's failure to oppose Saddam's suicidal invasion of Kuwait would weaken the PLO and condemn Palestinians there to the destruction of their community and another forced displacement. It all played out exactly as Abu Iyad had foreseen, but he paid for his timidity. He had reportedly even criticized Saddam Hussein in person. Elizabeth Thompson. Justice Interpreted. The Struggle for Constitutional Government in the Middle East. Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 2013, page 249. He was assassinated in Tunis on January 14, 1991, 3 days before the US-led offensive began. The gunman was acting for the Abu Nidal network, and by extension, undoubtedly, for Iraq, which the PLO intelligence services under Abu Iyad had hunted for years. The loss of Abu Iyad, coming 3 years after the killing of Abu Jihad, left no one in the top Fatah echelons with the structure or will to stand up to Arafat, a situation that only enhances inclination to high-handedness. The consequences of Arafat's ill-considered decision were not long in coming, beginning with the tragic uprooting of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from Kuwait after the country's liberation. The Gulf states halted all financial support to the PLO, which was ostracized in many Arab countries, including some of those that agreed to host its cadres after the 1982 evacuation from Beirut. Thus, after the 1990-91 Gulf War, the PLO found itself more friendless and alone than perhaps at any stage in its history. The icebergs on which Arafat and his comrades were afloat were melting fast, and they were desperately eager to jump to solid ground. It happened that the crisis coincided with a moment of American triumphalism, with the victory in Iraq and the end of the Soviet Union. In George H.W. Bush's State of the Union speech in January 1991, he hailed the New World Order, quote unquote, and the, quote, next American century, unquote. The Bush administration was determined to take advantage of the opportunity that Saddam's folly had given them to shape and define this New World Order, one that in their view necessitated a resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Israeli and American diplomats knew that the PLO's negotiating position was severely weakened. It was in this context that the Secretary of State, James Baker, began planning for a peace conference to be held in Madrid in October 1991, hoping to jumpstart direct Israeli-Arab talks and to determine the future of Palestine. When Arafat and his colleagues were eventually offered a proxy seat at the negotiating table, they were under so much pressure and so eager to leave their precarious perches in Tunis and elsewhere that they failed to assess their vast disadvantage. The setbacks that followed in the negotiations at Madrid, Washington, Oslo, and thereafter were thus to a large extent rooted in the PLO's epic miscalculation over Kuwait. In the summer of 1991, while doing research in Jerusalem, I paid a casual visit to Faisal Husseini, a relative by marriage who, until his untimely death in Kuwait, was the foremost Palestinian leader in Jerusalem and also a senior figure in Fatah. I had gone to consult on a minor problem among some of my cousins. I have a large and occasionally fractious family in Jerusalem. Faisal unexpectedly asked if I would agree to serve as an advisor to the Palestinian delegation to a peace conference to be convened by the United States. I knew that at the behest of the PLO, Husseini, Hanan Ashwai, Rawai, Haydar Abd al-Shafi, and others were in discussions with James Baker over the ground rules for the conference and the formation of the delegation. I also knew that Yitzhak Shamir, Israel's prime minister, was implacably opposed to the PLO's participation in any negotiations into the creation of a Palestinian state. So I was confident that the conference would never take place. I acquiesced to Faisal's request without giving it much thought, thanking him for his advice on our family problem, and took my leave. I found myself in Madrid a few months later in late October 1991, having failed to account for Baker's tenacity or the desperation of the PLO leadership in Tunis. At the outset of the conference, the dignified speech by the head of the Palestinian delegation, Abd al-Shafi, and the effective media appearances by Ashrawi gave many Palestinians the impression that their cause was at least getting traction and that their sacrifices of the Intifada were not in vain. However, various clouds hung over the conference and over all of subsequent bilateral negotiations with the Israelis in Madrid and later in Washington. The PLO had, via Baker, acquiesced to Shamir's condition that there would be no independent Palestinian representation at a conference that aimed to determine the fate of Palestine. So I was attached as an advisor to joint Jordanian-Palestinian delegation. Of course, the Palestinians' exclusion from an independent role in decisions about their lives was nothing new. The Palestinian delegation was eventually allowed to separate from that of Jordan. But Israel's veto extended to the choice of Palestinian representatives, and it blocked the participation of anyone connected to the PLO, or from Jerusalem, from the diaspora, which drastically narrowed the field of available delegates. Thanks to Baker's intervention, leaders excluded by these terms, such as Husseini, Ashrawi, and Sari Nuzibia, as well as advisors and legal diplomatic experts such as Raja Shahadi, Camille Mansour, and me, were allowed to join the delegation, but were barred from the formal talks with the Israelis. The humiliation of a procedure whereby Israel decreed with whom it would negotiate in what configuration had not deterred the PLO. More humiliation was to come. As well as dictating who could talk, the Shamir government determined what could be talked about. The limitations regarding Palestine that Begin had insisted on in Camp David Accords and in the 1979 peace treaty with Egypt were now applied to the three-day Madrid conference and the many subsequent months of discussions in Washington. For the Palestinians, only self-rule was on the table, whether under the rubric of autonomy or that of interim self-government. Every item of essence, Palestinian self-determination, sovereignty, the return of refugees and the end of occupation and colonization, the disposition of Jerusalem, the future of Jewish settlements, and control of land and water rights, was disallowed. Instead, these issues were postponed, supposedly for 4 years. But in fact, until a future that never came, the fabled final status talks were supposedly to be completed by 1997. This deadline was later extended to 1999 in the Oslo Accords, were never concluded. In the meanwhile, during an interim phase intended to only last until then, Israel was allowed to do exactly as it pleased in all of these domains. Thus, throughout the 1990s, the Palestinian negotiators at Madrid and elsewhere operated under imposed rules, restricting discussions to the terms of their ongoing colonization and occupation. The prospect of future relief from this interim phase was dangled before them by the sponsors of the Madrid Conference, but Palestinians in the occupied territories are still living in that temporary interim state over a quarter of a century later. The United States was ostensibly co-sponsoring the conference with the USSR, which was about to go out of existence and whose backing was nominal. In fact, Baker and Bush made all the decisions. Washington's ground rules were embodied in a carefully drafted letter of invitation to all parties, which included delegations from Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. The text of the U.S.-Soviet invitation to the Mideast Peace Conference in Madrid, October 18, 1991, can be found in William Kaunt's Peace Process, American Diplomacy in the Arab-Israeli Conflict Since 1967, 3rd edition, Washington, D.C., Brookings Institution Press, 2005. Appendix N. For the letter assurances to the Palestinians. And then 30. In a solemn commitment in the letter of invitation, the United States pledged to, quote, act as an honest broker in trying to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, unquote, in a, quote, comprehensive, unquote, fashion. The bid, Appendix N. Detailed, separate U.S. letters of assurance were also given to each of the delegations, and that addressed to the Palestinians, the United States committed itself to, quote, encourage all sides to avoid unilateral acts that would exacerbate local tensions or make negotiations more difficult or preempt their final outcome, unquote. And stress that, quote, no party should take unilateral actions that seek to predetermine issues that can only be resolved through negotiations, unquote. The letter of assurances to the Palestinians was dated October 18, 1991. See IBID, IBID, Appendix M. The United States never made good on these commitments, failing to prevent an unending series of unilateral Israeli actions, from settlement expansion and the closure of Jerusalem to West Bankers and Gazans, to the erection of a massive new network of walls, security barriers, and checkpoints. When they arrived in Madrid, none of the other members of the Palestinian delegation knew of Gerald Ford's 1975 explicit commitment to Rabin to avoid presenting any peace proposals of which Israel disapproved, nor did I. As mentioned in Chapter 4 and above, this letter was only revealed by the United States government when it was published in the Foreign Relations of the United States series in 2012. However, it had been published by Israel in its Foreign Ministry's documentary series 20 years before that in 1982, long before Madrid. We were all aware of the 1978 Camp David Accords, of the U.S. bias in favor of Israel, and of the partiality of many American diplomats, but we did not know of the degree to which Kissinger had tethered his successors to an Israeli platform. Had I understood how heavily the deck was stacked and the United States was bound in this way by a formal commitment, which meant that Israel effectively determined both its own position and that of its sponsor, I probably would not have gone to Madrid or spent much of the next 2 years engaged in the Washington talks. Even if I had been able to share this knowledge with the delegation, who were all from the occupied territories with no diplomatic experience, but who eventually proved to be formidable negotiators, it would have made little difference. All the important decisions on the Palestinian side were made by the PLO leaders in Tunis. So desperate were they to be brought into the negotiation process and to escape their isolation that even had they known how tightly bound the United States was to follow the Israeli line, I believe they likely have still made the mistakes they ended up making in the talks. With few allies, regionally or globally, little ability to put pressure on Israel, and a limited understanding of the nature of the occupation or of the arcane legal issues involved, they had essentially chosen to put all their eggs in the basket of a U.S. government obliged to express only points of view pre-approved by Israel. Most important, they had little patience for the pettifogging legal detail that negotiations with experienced Israeli diplomats necessitated, or for a long-term strategy that might have worn down Israel's stubbornness on key issues involving control of territory, the expansion of settlements, and Jerusalem. In bringing all the parties together, the Madrid Conference served its function of starting a comprehensive negotiation process. It was followed by several different tracks. The 3 Arab states, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, proceeded to bilateral talks with Israel on final peace treaties. Meanwhile, the Palestinian track, decoupled from that of Jordan, involved 10 rounds of discussions over a year and a half with Israeli representatives at the State Department in Washington. These remained rigidly restricted to the subject of limited self-rule in the West Bank and Gaza. Among many obstacles that prevented progress in Washington, the PLO leadership's flawed direction of the talks, the deceptive role of the United States, and Israel's obduracy on Palestinian rights, was the fact that while the Palestinian negotiators and their advisors gradually developed legal and diplomatic expertise, the leaders in Tunis had no understanding of its crucial importance in the process. This was all more important given the distorted part played by many of the American personnel involved. Several were loath to push the Israelis on any issue of substance, such as settlement, expansion, and the status of Jerusalem during the interim period, or the scope of the jurisdiction of the Palestinians, were to have over the areas and populations that would become nominally autonomous. Whatever the issue at hand, the United States representatives considered the Israeli position, as they read it, to be the ceiling of what was feasible or could be discussed. We knew that they coordinated closely with the Israeli peers, and some of them took the formal but secret U.S. commitment to Israel to an extreme. American negotiator Aaron David Miller later regretfully used the term, quote, Israel's lawyer, unquote, to describe his stance that of many of his colleagues. Aaron David Miller, quote, Israel's lawyer, unquote, Washington Post, May 23, 2005. Aptly, the term was apparently coined by Henry Kissinger, who knew a thing or two about American advocacy of Israeli policy. Aaron David Miller, The Much Too Promised Land, New York, Bantam, 2008, page 80. Quite different in this respect from any of his subordinates was James Baker, a man with extraordinarily fine political instincts and an acute sense of the ways to deploy power. He and Bush understood the benefit to the United States in the post-Cold War moment of a comprehensive resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and intuited that reaching a lasting agreement would require putting pressure on Israel. Baker also had enough backbone and close enough relationship with the president to ignore the limitations on U.S. freedom of action negotiated in 1975 by Kissinger, or at least to interpret these limitations loosely in light of what they saw as the U.S. national interest. They had done this to get the negotiations started. When Shamir stonewalled the administration's initial effort to sponsor a conference, Baker was not afraid to confront the Shamir government publicly, saying, quote, "When you're serious about peace, call us," unquote, and offering the White House phone number. Quote, "When you're serious, call us," unquote. Newsweek, June 24th, 1990. Baker pushed relentlessly for Palestinian participation at Madrid, in the teeth of stubborn opposition from Shamir. Those of us who met Baker sensed that he had sympathy for the predicament of Palestinians under occupation and understood our frustration at the absurd restraints imposed by the Shamir government. This sympathy was in part the result of his prolonged interactions with Husseini, Ashwari, Abdel Shafi, and their colleagues during meeting to prepare for the conference. But Baker was only able or willing to do so much. Among the most important things he did not do was restrain Israeli actions that systematically changed the status quo in Palestine, while negotiations were underway. These included continuous building of settlements and barring residents of the rest of the occupied territories from entering Jerusalem. Both were grave violations of the United States commitments embodied in Baker's letter of assurance. In the Palestinian view, by these actions, Israel was preemptively eating the cake that the two sides were supposed to be dividing, while exploiting the prohibition on the Palestinian delegates that prevented them from talking about final status issues. Although the Bush administration's impatience with Shamir's obstructionism and the ceaseless pace of colonization of the West Bank led it to withhold $10 billion in loan guarantees that Israel sought for the resettlement of Russian Jews, this had little or no effect on the Israeli government. John Goshko, quote, "Baker bars Israeli loan aid unless settlements are halted," unquote. Washington Post, February 25th, 1992. More than this Washington would not do. In any case, Baker was gone from the State Department 10 months after Madrid, drafted in August 1992 to run Bush's failing presidential campaign. From that point on, the junior officials who had been firmly under Baker's control while he was Secretary of State took over the shop, and they did not have his stature, his steely will in dealing with Israel, his even-handedness, or his vision. The situation went on for the remaining few months of the Bush administration, and then became worse under Bill Clinton, who won election in November that year, and his two undistinguished Secretaries of State, Warren Christopher and Madeleine Albright. No one at the top of the new administration had the same view of the process of Israel or of the Palestine issue as had Bush and Baker, and all were strongly under the influence of the officials they inherited from the Bush administration, especially Dennis Ross. Many members of this group of experts had a strong personal affinity for labor Zionism and deep admiration for Rabin, which was also true of Bill Clinton, who became prime minister in June 1992. They had made their reputations and careers by working the so-called peace process, which had been dragging on since the 1978 Camp David summit. The rise of these peace process professionals marked the demise of a generation of so-called Arabists in the State Department and other branches of government. The latter were mainly veterans of lengthy government service in the Middle East with extensive language capabilities, who brought to their jobs a deep understanding of the region and of the U.S. positions in it. They were often vilified by flaques of such lobbies as the American Israel Public Affairs Committee as being anti-Israel, which was a fiction. In fact, they simply did not represent an Israel-centric view, unlike most of those who eventually succeeded them. The key text in the campaign against them was Robert Kaplan, Arabist's Romance of an American Elite, New York Free Press, 1995, based on a series of scathing articles that appeared in The Atlantic. Another carping critic of both American diplomacy and Middle East scholarship is Martin Kramer, Ivory Towers on Sand, The Failure of Middle Eastern Studies in America, Washington, D.C., Washington Institute for Near East Policy, 2001. A student of Bernard Lewis, Kramer is one in a long line of far-right detractors of Western policies in the Middle East as being insufficiently pro-Israel and anti-Arab, going back to the Baghdad-born British academic Eli Kdori. Their successors were men, they were all men, who had been involved in this issue to the exclusion of almost everything else. The Israelis, the East is a career, became the peace process is a career. They generally had academic expertise. Dennis Ross, Martin Indyk, Daniel Kurtzer, and Miller all had PhDs. The former two received their PhDs in international relations, and thus were in no way Middle East experts, and Kurtzer and Miller in Middle East studies. But they had not spent years serving in the Middle East, nor did they have any particular sympathy for the region or its peoples, except for Israel. Several of them later served as U.S. ambassadors, Kurtzer to Egypt and Israel, and Indyk to Israel. Others as Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East, Head of Policy Planning at the State Department, and in the National Security Council. The doyen of these peace process professionals, and by far the most partisan, was Dennis Ross. As one senior State Department official said of him, Ross's bad habit is pre-consultation with the Israelis. Roger Cohen, The Making of an Iran Policy, New York Times Magazine, July 30th, 2009. Another was even more scathing. Ross, he said, was prone to, quote, preemptive capitulations to red lines, unquote, referring to Israel's red lines. Peter Beinart, quote, Obama betrayed ideals on Israel, unquote. Newsweek, March 12, 2012. Over the decades that he dealt with this dossier, Ross's deep and abiding commitment to Israel only became more apparent. Dossier, whatever. Especially after he left government services in 2011. He had been in and out of public office since the mid-1970s. Thereafter, he became a lobbyist for Israel in all but name as head of the Jewish People Policy Planning Institute, a body founded and funded by the Jewish Agency, and a distinguished fellow at the AIPAC-supported Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which he co-founded together with Martin Indyk. The other co-founder of WINEP, Martin Indyk, had also previously worked for AIPAC and became a key figure in the negotiations during the Clinton administration, which arranged rapid approval of U.S. citizenship for this Australian national so that he could take up a government post in 1993. Indyk was later U.S. ambassador in Tel Aviv, where this veteran fighter for Israel's interests in Washington was vilified as too soft, as was his colleague Dan Kurtzer when he held the same position. Neither was spared continuous vulgar abuse by the Israeli hard right despite the fact that both were Jewish. The overt bias of Dennis Ross and some of his colleagues was obvious in all of our interactions. Their key characteristic was that they accepted Israel's stated public positions as the limit of what was admissible in terms of U.S. policy. For Ross and others, this outlook was rooted in their core beliefs. Indeed, Ross took his partiality to Israel even further, making his own assessments of what Israel would not accept, and therefore what the U.S. could not countenance. These assessments often proved to be wrong. He deemed recognition of the PLO and its involvement in negotiations unacceptable to Israel, even though Rabin, in fact, eventually agreed to these terms. During one stalemate in Washington, the U.S. side, which had steadfastly refused to put forward its own ideas, agreed to offer what it called, quote, bridging proposal, unquote. Proudly presented by Ross, this bridge to nowhere was even less forthcoming than the last position informally put forward by the Israelis themselves. Our Khalidi, Brokers of Deceit, page 56. Ross's bias was apparent at another point in the talks, when in my hearing he threatened that if the Palestinian delegation did not accept the contentious point being pressed on them by Israel, Washington would get their, quote, friends in the Gulf, unquote, to lean on them. The obstacles posed by Israel were of a complete different nature. While Shamir was prime minister, there was constant squabbling over procedure and a painful dialogue of the deaf as far as substance was concerned. In particular, Israel was wedding to Begin's vision, enunciated at Camp David in 1978, of autonomy for the people, but not the land. This was in keeping with the Israeli right's view, indeed the core of the Zionist doctrine, that only one people, the Jewish people, had a legitimate right to existence and sovereignty in the entirety of the land, which was called Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, not Palestine. The Palestinians were at best interlopers. In practice, this meant that when the Palestinians argued for broad legal and territorial jurisdiction from the future self-governing authority, they were met with a firm refusal from Israeli negotiators. Similarly, there was a refusal to limit settlement activity in any way. This was not surprising. Famously, Shamir was reported as saying that he would have dragged out the talks for 10 more years while, quote, vastly increasing the number of Jewish settlers in Israeli-occupied territory, unquote. Clyde Haberman, quote, Shamir is said to admit plan to stall talks for 10 years, unquote. New York Times, June 27, 1992. After a labor-led coalition replaced Shamir's government, Rabin, now prime minister, wavered between prioritizing the Syrian or the Palestinian track. Ever the strategist, he realized that one of the advantages of reaching a deal with Syria was that it would put the Palestinians in a weaker position, making them easier to deal with. Rabin also felt that an agreement on the Syrian front was more strategically significant, relatively straightforward, and achievable. He was probably right about the last point, and he and Hafez al-Assad nearly managed to reach an agreement. This is confirmed by Rabin's biographer and close colleague, Itamar Rabinovich, who was the lead Israeli negotiator with Syria, Yitzhak Rabin, 177 to 85, 193 to 99. As evidence of his seriousness in regard to Syria, Rabin appointed Itamar Rabinovich as chief negotiator on the Syrian track, and concurrently as Israel's ambassador to the U.S. A reserve colonial colonel in the Israeli army where he had been a senior intelligence officer and a prominent academic with deep expertise on Syria, Rabinovich was an ideal choice for this position. His appointment led to what he himself described as some progress with the Syrians. Although in the end the two sides could not come to terms, separated mainly by disagreement over the disposition of a few strategic square miles on the shoreline of the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. This fairly uncomplicated but weighty problem was considerably amplified by the intense opposition in several quarters in Israel, and among them its most fervent supporters in the U.S., to any withdrawal from the Golan Heights, a step which Rabin was prepared to contemplate. In the midst of the negotiations, I happened to attend a talk in Chicago where Rabinovich failed utterly to convince Israel's hardline supporters among the group that a deal with Syria was both feasible and desirable. This irrational opposition, I pointed out to Rabinovich, was something Israel had created for itself by its prior demonization of Assyria, with which he and Rabin were now convinced that Israel could reach an agreement. By contrast to his relatively flexible approach to Syria and his appointment of a highly suitable envoy, Rabin changed little in Israel's core approach to the Palestinians at the negotiating table. He kept in place the chief of the Israeli delegation, Eliakim Rubinstein, an experienced diplomat and later a Supreme Court justice, who was tough as nails in his dealings with us. There were some shifts in Israel's positions on Palestinian elections, the continuity of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and a few other matters. But the central element in Rubinstein's brief remained restricted to the most rigidly limited form of self-rule and nothing more. There was a palpable disappointment within the Palestinian delegation and in Tunis when we realized that Israel's change of government did not herald a substantive change of views. We should not have been surprised. In a speech given in 1989, Rabin had made clear his commitment to Benin's Camp David approach, Rabin, Begin, including autonomy but no independent state for the Palestinians. Abid 165. 6 years later, in October 1995, less than a month before he was assassinated, Rabin told the Knesset that any Palestinian entity to be created would be less than a state. Abid 212 through 14. All right, I'm going to call it there. It looks like page 255 is the end, and we are at page 194. As always, thank you for joining me and thank you for being here. I really appreciate you. Make it a great day.